Imagine the edge of Missouri in the 1840s. A dusty trail stretches out toward an endless horizon, and dozens of wagons stand ready in the tall grass, each one loaded with barrels, crates, and carefully wrapped bundles of family treasures. The air hums with nervous excitement. Fathers double-check harnesses, mothers clutch children close, and neighbors huddle together, whispering prayers for courage. To stand there was to believe you were at the gateway of destiny. This wasn't just a journey across miles of wilderness. It was the promise of a new life. The call of the West echoed through newspapers, letters, and the mouths of returning settlers who painted pictures of a land overflowing with riches and opportunity. Gold shimmered in stories, fertile land stretched out in imagination, and the idea of freedom seemed as boundless as the plains themselves. For many, it was less about what they were going to find and more about what they were leaving behind. Crook landlords, rising debts, and the heavy grip of poverty pushed families toward the frontier. The road west was both an escape and an invitation. In those first days, before the wheels even turned, the dream glowed brighter than any hardship could dim. A farmer might sell his land for a fraction of its worth. A blacksmith might trade his shop for a chance at acres of his own, and a widow might decide the only way forward was to gather her children and start again in a place where no one knew her losses. Entire lives were condensed into what could fit on a wagon bed. Furniture, family Bibles, pots, and pans became not just objects, but symbols of continuity in the face of uncertainty. The formation of wagon trains was itself a sight to behold. Lines of white canvas tops stood like a fleet of ships ready to set sail across a sea of grass. Neighbors who had only ever seen each other in Sunday pews now found themselves bound together in something deeper, something like family. Children chased each other between wagons, laughter mixing with the creak of ox yokes and the low murmur of men debating which trail would prove the safest. It felt less like leaving and more like stepping into a chapter of America's grand story. Romantic visions added to the atmosphere. Newspapers described the West as Eden. Novels turned pioneers into heroes, and preachers spoke of it as a divine calling. Around campfires the night before departure, voices carried tales of gold nuggets picked up from riverbeds, of valleys lush with green, and of towns waiting to be built by strong hands. In those moments, danger was an afterthought, a shadow that couldn't dim the light of expectation. And yet, hidden beneath that glow was a truth no one could fully ignore. The road ahead promised not only fortune but loss, not only freedom but hardship. For every dreamer who gazed toward the horizon, there lingered the unspoken question: would the West keep its promise, or would it break them? But before the journey could even begin, travelers faced their first challenge: the wagons themselves. Covered wagons looked cozy in paintings, their white canvas tops glowing in the sunlight like floating clouds against the plains. But step closer and the illusion fades. Inside, there was no comfort, only cramped wooden boards, narrow enough that most families quickly learned the wagons weren't meant for living. Measuring just about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long, they were designed to haul supplies, not carry passengers. What little space existed was packed with barrels of flour, sacks of beans, spare axles, and the tools of survival. For people, there was hardly any room at all. Those who imagined riding in their wagons soon learned otherwise. Without springs or suspension, the constant jolt of the wheels over ruts and rocks rattled bones and bruised backs. Even the healthiest traveler found the ride unbearable after only a short distance. Children might be allowed to perch on the edge for a while, but most families walked beside the lumbering oxen, mile after mile, their feet raising clouds of dust that clung to skin and clothes. On the roughest days, travelers trudged alongside creaking wheels from dawn until dusk, the wagon always just out of reach of comfort. The design itself made the hardships worse. The canvas tops provided some shade, but heat gathered beneath them until the air felt like an oven. Rain seeped through the fabric and turned the wagon floor into mud. In high winds, the whole structure shook, threatening to tear the cover free. And when storms swept across the plains, the wagons offered little more protection than standing beneath a tree. The West did not make travel easy, and the wagons reflected that truth. Repairs were constant companions on the journey. Axles snapped, wheels splintered, and metal rims loosened in the shifting heat. A single breakdown could delay an entire train, forcing weary families to gather tools and patch what they could with rope, wood, or sheer determination. Some carried blacksmith's kits, others spare wood, but most relied on ingenuity and luck. The sight of men bent beneath wagons, hammering at cracked timbers, was as common as the sight of children running in the dust. Exposure added another cruel layer. Summer sun beat down until the ground shimmered with heat, while cold nights wrapped travelers in a chill that seeped into their bones. Dust coated every surface, filling mouths and eyes, grinding between teeth with every bite of bread. The wagons held the tools of survival, but they offered little comfort against the extremes of nature. In truth, they were less a home than a moving storage shed, pulled by the strength of oxen and the will of the families walking behind. The romance of painted wagons gliding gracefully across the prairie lived only in imagination. On the trail, the wagons groaned, jolted, and demanded constant care. They carried the dream of the West, but they offered no rest to those chasing it. And if the wagon didn't wear you down, the food surely did. Forget steak dinners. Out on the wagon trail, food was stripped down to its bare essentials. Most days, pioneers counted themselves lucky if they had a pot of beans simmering over the fire, a few hard biscuits to chew, and a bitter cup of coffee to chase it down. Meals were less about pleasure and more about survival. The West demanded efficiency, and the diet reflected it: simple, heavy, and endlessly repetitive. Flour, bacon, beans, coffee, and dried fruit formed the backbone of the pioneer pantry. Barrels and sacks were packed tight at the start of the journey, each pound carefully measured to stretch across months of travel. The bacon was salted until it was tough and leathery. Beans were dry and hard until hours of boiling softened them. And biscuits, often called hardtack, were so dense they could crack a tooth if not soaked first. Coffee, when it lasted, was boiled strong, black, and often reused until it tasted like little more than hot water. Spoilage was a constant worry. Meat turned rancid in the heat. Flour sprouted weevils, and sugar clumped into hard blocks. A single leak in a barrel or tier in a sack could ruin supplies meant to last weeks. Mothers and fathers watched anxiously as their stockpiles shrank, knowing there was no guarantee of finding replacements along the trail. Trading posts were few and far between, and when goods were available, prices were painfully high. Hunting and fishing seemed like hopeful solutions, but the reality was unpredictable. Deer and buffalo might appear one day and vanish the next. Rivers promised fish, but the catch was never enough to feed an entire train of hungry families. Ammunition had to be saved for protection, and time spent chasing game meant time lost on the road. The balance between progress and survival left little room for luxuries. The monotony of meals wore on spirits as much as hunger itself. Children grew tired of beans. Adults longed for fresh bread or vegetables. Every mouthful reminded them of what they had left behind: orchards heavy with fruit, gardens bright with green, a simple roast chicken on a Sunday table. Out here, food was fuel, not comfort, and the absence of variety became a quiet burden carried day after day. Malnutrition crept in with devastating effects. Without fresh produce, scurvy weakened gums and bones. Poor sanitation turned spoiled food into dysentery, a sickness that spread quickly and drained the strength of entire families. What began as a lack of flavor often ended in fever, weakness, and, too often, death. Around the fire at night, the clatter of tin plates sometimes fell into silence, the weight of survival pressing heavier than the food itself. Food on the trail was never the feast that stories imagined. It was beans, biscuits, and the endless grind of sameness. It was hunger that never truly left, and the constant gamble of whether there would be enough for tomorrow. But poor food wasn't the only thing gnawing at travelers, so were the endless miles. Most pioneers didn't ride in the wagon. They walked every single mile, across mountains, rivers, and endless plains. The image of a family comfortably seated beneath the canvas cover was more fantasy than fact. Wagons were far too heavy, overloaded with barrels of flour, tools, and spare wood. To climb inside meant slowing the oxen and risking a breakdown. So day after day, men, women, and children trudged beside the creaking wheels, their boots sinking into dust, mud, or snow, depending on the season. The pace was steady but grueling. 10 to 15 miles in a day was considered good progress, yet it often felt like an eternity under the wide, empty sky. Morning began with the crack of a whip and the groan of oxen straining against yokes. By noon, the sun beat down mercilessly, raising heat waves from the earth until the horizon itself seemed to waver. Each mile stretched endlessly, with only the distant silhouette of hills or the line of another wagon ahead to mark the way forward. Exhaustion became a constant companion. Feet blistered and bled inside warm boots. Backs ached from lifting, pushing, and steadying the wagons over rough terrain. Even children, though they often darted about with bursts of energy, felt the weight of miles after weeks on the trail. The steady plod of footsteps turned into a rhythm, a drumbeat of survival that carried on long after strength had faded. The land itself was unforgiving. Rivers had to be crossed, sometimes waist-deep and swift enough to sweep away livestock. Mud sucked at wagon wheels, trapping them until entire groups joined forces to push and pull. Rocky ground tore at shoes, and jagged slopes tested both balance and courage. One misstep could twist an ankle or break a bone, and out here, such injuries weren't just painful, they could be fatal. There were no hospitals, no easy roads back home. Every stumble carried weight. Injuries from sheer overuse were just as dangerous. Joints swelled, muscles stiffened, and fatigue wore down even the strongest travelers. Rest at night was never enough to undo the strain of the day. Instead, each morning began with bodies already sore, facing the knowledge that hundreds more miles still lay ahead. Walking across the continent was not a single feat of endurance. It was thousands of small, painful steps added together. Perhaps the hardest part was the monotony. The plains stretched endlessly, mile after mile of grass and sky that seemed to repeat without end. Travelers spoke of days where nothing changed, no tree, no hill, no shade, just the same horizon, retreating with every step. The landscape itself became a test of the mind, asking not just for strength, but for the will to keep going when everything looked the same. The road west was not paved with adventure, but with sweat and sore feet. It demanded every ounce of stamina from those who dared to walk it, and still it asked for more. And while tired legs could rest at night, the dangers lurking on the trail never did. Rattlesnakes in the grass, river crossings that swallowed wagons whole. The West was as deadly as it was beautiful. For every sunrise that lit up the horizon in golden light, there was a shadow waiting to test the courage of those on the trail. Danger wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty. The question was never if it would strike, but when. Snakes were among the ever-present threats, coiled beneath brush or hidden in the tall grass that brushed against wagon wheels. A single bite could swell a limb, blacken flesh, and leave families scrambling for remedies that rarely worked. Wild animals added their own menace. Wolves followed the trains at night, waiting for the weak or the lost. Bears roamed the forests and could turn a quiet camp into chaos with a single appearance. The wilderness, majestic as it was, never allowed travelers to forget that they were strangers in its domain. Rivers, too, were merciless. Their waters looked calm on the surface, but the currents were strong enough to drag wagons, oxen, and people beneath. Families gathered on the banks, weighing the risk of crossing against the need to press forward. Improvised rafts were built, wheels were wrapped for traction, and prayers were whispered as wagons rolled into the water. Many made it through. Too many did not. A wagon lost to the current could take with it supplies, livestock, and sometimes entire families. Even when the land seemed still, accidents struck. A wheel might splinter on a hidden stone, toppling the wagon onto its side. A loose axe swung too wide could sever fingers. A gun fired too quickly could take a life before a word was spoken. Tools meant for survival carried sharp edges, and fatigue only made them more dangerous. Every task, from chopping wood to repairing axles, carried the risk of turning fatal in an instant. Then came the weather. Storms swept across the plains without warning, tearing canvas from wagons and leaving families soaked and shivering. The sun baked the ground until it cracked, forcing lips dry and blistering skin. Snow came early in the mountains, sealing passes and trapping wagon trains in icy prisons. Against nature's fury, the pioneers had little defense beyond sheer determination. And if the outside world wasn't cruel enough, the closeness of life on the trail created its own hazards. Families lived side by side in crowded camps, sharing water, food, and air. Illness spread like fire, turning one cough into a chorus and one fever into an epidemic. The very bonds that gave people strength also became pathways for danger. The trail west was not just a road of progress, but a gauntlet of trials. Each mile carried with it the possibility of disaster, each day a test of survival. And sometimes the biggest enemy wasn't outside, it came from within. Forget shootouts, most deaths on the trail came quietly from sickness with no cure. The stories of the Old West often celebrate duels and daring escapes, but the truth of the wagon journey was far more somber. Death usually arrived not with a bullet, but with a fever. Families set out chasing dreams of new land and better lives. Yet along the trail, disease became the most merciless thief of all. Cholera was the great terror of the plains. It could sweep through a wagon train in days, leaving families helpless as loved ones collapsed from relentless vomiting and diarrhea. Dysentery followed close behind, spreading through contaminated water and food handled in unsanitary conditions. Typhoid fever, another invisible enemy, brought high temperatures and delirium, leaving the sick weak and unrecognizable. These illnesses carried no warning, no cure, and no mercy. In an age before antibiotics, even the smallest infection could grow deadly. The trail itself encouraged sickness. Hundreds of travelers moved together, often drinking from the same rivers where animals waded and where the dead were sometimes buried too close to the banks. Water that looked clear could carry unseen dangers. Sanitation was almost impossible to maintain when every stop meant setting up camp in the open wilderness. A cough, a cut, or a sip from the wrong stream could be enough to doom a traveler. Doctors were few and far between. Most wagon trains had no medical professional at all, relying instead on folk remedies or whatever advice could be gathered from neighbors. A bottle of laudanum, a pouch of herbs, or a family Bible might be all a sick person had for comfort. Mothers did what they could, but often their efforts ended in quiet weeping beside a child's bedroll. Children were especially vulnerable. Their smaller bodies couldn't withstand the dehydration and fevers that swept through the camps. For many families, the hardest moments of the journey were marked by tiny graves left behind along the trail. These makeshift burials dotted the landscape, stones piled by grieving parents, names scratched into wood that the wind and rain would eventually erase. Every fresh mound of earth was a reminder of the cost of chasing the horizon. Fear moved as swiftly as the sickness itself. At the first sign of a cough or fever, whispers spread through the wagon train. Families began keeping their distance, some avoiding handshakes, others reluctant to share food. Bonds of trust weakened beneath the shadow of contagion. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival, and everyone knew that disease could choose its victims without reason. The silent killer shaped the memory of the West in ways history books rarely capture. For every mile gained, there was the risk of a life lost, a family broken, or a dream buried by the side of the road. The creak of wagon wheels and the laughter of children often mixed with the sobs of mourning parents, reminding all who traveled that hope and grief rode side by side. And even if disease didn't strike, the journey carried another cruel weight: loneliness. Imagine months without letters, no news from home, just the creak of wagon wheels and the endless horizon. For the families who set out across the plains, isolation was not just a passing feeling. It was the constant backdrop of their journey. Every day carried them farther from familiar towns, churches, and neighbors, into a silence so vast it could swallow even the strongest hearts. The frontier was not only a test of body but of spirit, and loneliness was its sharpest edge. Back east, most people were never more than a few miles from the community, a general store, a post office, a Sunday service. On the trail, such comforts disappeared. Letters could not catch up to moving wagons, and news traveled far slower than the families themselves. Weeks blurred into months without word from loved ones left behind. For parents, it was annoying uncertainty. Were grandparents still alive? Had the farm back home survived the winter? They had no way of knowing. The sheer scale of the plains deepened this sense of separation. Day after day, travelers faced horizons that stretched endlessly, a sky so wide it made people feel small, insignificant, and terribly alone. The land offered beauty, yes, but also a crushing emptiness. With no fences, no towns, no familiar markers of civilization, it was easy to feel as though the rest of the world had vanished entirely. At night, campfires became a fragile shield against that emptiness. Families gathered close, telling stories, singing hymns, or simply sitting in silence, listening to the flames crackle. These small rituals reminded them they were still human, still connected, even as the wilderness pressed in around them. For many, the firelight was the only comfort in a darkness that seemed to have no end. Wagon trains themselves became a kind of substitute community. Strangers, once bound by nothing more than the same road west, began to share food, lend tools, and watch over one another's children. Bonds grew quickly under such conditions. Friendships were forged by hardship, sealed by necessity, and deepened by the knowledge that survival often depended on cooperation. A kind word or a helping hand could mean the difference between despair and hope. Still, no amount of companionship could fully erase loneliness. The human heart ached for the familiar sight of a home left behind, the voice of a loved one too far away to call. Some nights, tears were shed quietly in bedrolls, hidden from others so as not to burden already weary companions. Hope had to be carried like a hidden ember, tended carefully, kept alive against the cold winds of doubt. Loneliness on the trail was not a fleeting emotion. It was a constant weight. Yet in carrying it, pioneers revealed a resilience that few today can imagine. They walked onward, holding fast to the dream that somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon, lay a new beginning worth the sacrifice. But as the miles stretched on, even the strongest bonds were tested by death. Travelers called it the Trail of Graves because nearly every mile, another life was lost. The journey west was marked not just by wagon tracks in the dirt, but by the silent presence of countless burial mounds, each one a story cut short. For all the dreams that fueled the migration, the road itself became a vast and haunting cemetery. Death on the trail was not rare, it was expected. Disease claimed the most lives, swift and merciless. A sudden case of cholera could turn a lively camp into a place of mourning in a matter of hours. Accidents were just as unforgiving. A broken wheel on uneven ground, a misstep near a rushing river, or a fall from a wagon could prove fatal. Hunger and exhaustion wore bodies thin, making people more vulnerable to sickness, while the relentless miles stripped away their strength. For families, the most heartbreaking part was the necessity of moving on. Graves were shallow, often marked with hastily gathered stones, a wooden cross, or even just a carved name on a wagon board. The earth was too hard in places, too soft in others, and always unforgiving. There was no time for proper mourning, no chance to linger. A child buried at dawn might be left behind by midday. The family forced to keep walking, hearts torn in two. The trail itself became a living reminder of loss. Travelers spoke of riding past graves almost daily, scattered along ridges, riverbanks, and prairies. Some counted hundreds. For those still alive, the constant sight of death pressed down heavily, a grim reminder that their fate could change at any moment. Even children came to recognize what these markers meant. Tiny shapes in the earth that spoke louder than words ever could. The emotional toll was immense. Parents feared for their children. Wives feared for husbands. Brothers feared for sisters. Every cough, every fever, every stumble raised the same silent question. Would this be the next grave along the trail? Fear traveled with the wagons as surely as the creak of the wheels and the dust in the air. And yet there was something deeply human in how people carried on. They sang hymns over shallow graves, whispered prayers into the night, and shared quiet words of comfort with fellow travelers who knew the same pain. Grief became a part of the journey itself, woven into the fabric of westward expansion. The Trail of Graves was both a warning and a testament, a warning of how brutal the frontier could be, but also a testament to the strength of those who walked it. For every mound of earth left behind, the wagons kept rolling forward, driven not only by desperation, but by an unshakable hope that life ahead might still hold meaning. And yet, despite it all, the wagons kept rolling, pulled by something stronger than fear. What drove families through misery, danger, and loss? A single word of hope. It was the quiet force that pushed weary feet another mile, that kept hands steady on the reins, that made men and women rise at dawn no matter how broken their bodies felt. Hope was not abstract, it was tangible, alive in every story whispered around the fire, every promise made to children as the horizon stretched endlessly ahead. For many, that hope was rooted in the land itself. The promise of fertile soil, wide open spaces, and a chance to finally own property pulled people west with a strength greater than fear. In the crowded towns of the East, opportunity was scarce. But out beyond the plains, the dream of independence waited. Families believed that if they endured the journey, they could plant roots where no landlord or neighbor could tell them how to live. Others were driven by the idea of freedom in its broadest sense. To leave behind debts, crowded streets, and old burdens was to step into a new life. The West carried with it a sense of endless possibility, where the past might finally loosen its grip and a fresh chapter could begin. This belief in renewal gave travelers the courage to leave graves behind, to keep pressing forward when sorrow made the road nearly unbearable. The era carried with it the powerful current of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were meant to spread across the continent, that it was their duty and their right to claim the wilderness. To some, this conviction gave their suffering purpose. Every mile walked, every storm endured, was seen as part of a larger mission, a way to secure a future not just for themselves, but for generations to come. At its heart, though, the promise was deeply personal. Parents dreamed of handing their children a better future, a farm of their own, fresh air, and freedom from want. For children born on the trail, the West was not a gamble, but a birthright, something they would inherit from the sacrifices of their mothers and fathers. These quiet dreams of safety, prosperity, and love outweighed the dust, the hunger, and even the constant nearness of death. And through it all, there was also adventure. For every grim tale of hardship, there were moments of awe. The first glimpse of mountains rising like giants from the plains, the sudden rush of a river sparkling under the sun, the feeling of standing in a land so wide it seemed without end. These moments reminded travelers that they were part of something bigger, that their journey was as much about wonder as it was about survival. The covered wagon, creaking and stubborn, became more than a vehicle. It became a symbol of grit, of endurance, of the courage to chase something better no matter the cost. It carried not just supplies, but the weight of human determination, rolling mile after mile into history. And so, through misery and danger, it was hope that triumphed. Hope turned the wagon trail from a road of graves into a road of beginnings. It is the same hope that echoes through time, reminding us of the strength buried deep within ordinary people who dared to dream. Would you have survived the wagon trail?